Dzień dobry, witam Państwa na wykładzie Nabila Ahmeda. Nabil Ahmed jest reprezentantem kolektywu artystyczno-śledczego INTERPRT, który zajmuje się w zasadzie dokumentowaniem, zbieraniem dowodów, analizowaniem rozmaitych zbrodni związanych z naturą, z dewastacją, destrukcją natury. Od lat ten kolektyw bada rozmaite przypadki ekobójstwa, które rozumiane jest no właśnie jako zbrodnia w świetle prawa międzynarodowego, ekobójstwa, które polega na celowym, intencjonalnym zniszczeniu całych ekosystemów i ekobójstwa jako przestępstwa, w którym podmiotem prawnym jest natura, nie człowiek, nie natura w sposób pośredni, ale właśnie natura. Jednemu z takich przypadków poświęcona jest wystawa, którą pewnie część z Państwa już widziała na pierwszym piętrze. Rasa i las, Race and Forest. Wystawa, która dokumentuje w ogromnej swojej części jeden bardzo konkretny przypadek ekobójstwa, przypadek związany z destrukcją polskich lasów w trakcie II wojny światowej, destrukcją polskich lasów właśnie w sposób metodyczny, planowy, związany jakby z działaniami wojennymi. So that's just a short introduction of the context. Nabil Ahmed, I've got it's a pleasure to have your talk today, and I'm super curious about this topic of impunity and of environmental justice, because these are topics of Nabil's lecture. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bartek, for the introduction. So for the last 5 to 6 years, myself and a number of people that are working with me, we started a project called INTERPRT that Bartek sort of also mentioned. And this project's work has basically three kind of corners of the triangle, if you'd like. One is that we conduct civil society environmental forensic investigations on underreported environmental crimes. We work with civil society groups, lawyers, scientists, and various other sort of groups. But secondly, we also do advocacy work, because environmental crime today is not recognized at an international level. And the term or the crime that we're looking to introduce into international law, working with a wide group of actors, is the crime of ecocide. And the third corner of the triangle is perhaps the subject of the exhibition that's upstairs, or connects to it, which is that we're very much interested in also looking at the historical, theoretical sort of basis for doing the work that we do. So, of course, the exhibition upstairs looks at a very unique case in the history of international criminal justice, which is the first attempt to prosecute the destruction of forests, which, if we look at the news today, or if we look at what happened here in Białowieża, this is as relevant as it was in the 40s. So this, but the work we're doing, so my talk today sort of split into two parts. First, I want to unpack a little bit the political claims of the exhibition that we have staged upstairs, very much in collaboration with Biennale Warsaw, but also with the Museum of Modern Art in Warsaw, the two institutions that we're very closely working with for some time now. But the second part of the talk will focus rather on some of the investigative work that we're doing, and I hope that that together they will give us perhaps some points to discuss. I'd like to begin with an image. This is an image from our archival research upstairs. And this image is one where there are 6 scientific foresters or forestry officials standing around a map in somewhere in occupied Poland during the occupation of Poland by the Nazi Germany. And this image, you know, is a powerful image because it as the exhibition does in a much more broader way, this image perhaps brings together certain sort of themes that I think are really relevant to us today, which is that here there were a group of sort of foresters deciding on how the forests of Poland would be used for the German war machine, for the German war effort. So he was an example of a kind of settler colonial kind of a project, right? Which nevertheless at the same time as it doesn't value sort of you know, the life of the occupied people, and in particular Jews of Poland and of Europe, it is also, its intention is also to take resources, right? So there's a resource extraction, settler colonialism at work. However, in this image, one particular person was of much interest to us, which was this man, Forstmeister Spletstotter, who in the archival research we did for the Race and Forest exhibition found that a set of gazettes called Wald und Holz, which are prominently sort of displayed upstairs, was a way for the forest officials of the Nazi German state, a way for them to keep track and sort of even theorize about how they were using forests and how they're occupying Poland through the occupation of forests. So, which sort of included very much administrative documents, logistical data about timber production and etc. Right? There were also trade magazines, so there were a lot of material about you know, what might be the best machine to cut you know, wood to a certain piece or etc. However, as Spletstotter's essay sort of reveals, there was something much more insidious at work. This is an image that we were shocked and fascinated by at the same time, because this image was part of the essay that Spletstotter wrote, titled "Race and Forest." So what this map actually shows, which is a unique document of the Second World War, because what the document shows is that it redefines the occupation of Poland through a racist ideology, and also by claiming that occupied Poland is where the battle has to be waged between the Germanic people and the Slavic people, but via climatic lines, right? So, So lines of Asian climates or have to fight the lines of northern climates, right? I mean, it's all very preposterous, but there's a kind of logic in let's say, the quotes that we read from the article that are relevant today, even in the context of, let's say, eco-fascist groups that are very much active on the internet, but also who were responsible, for example, for the killing of the shooting at the mosque in Christchurch in New Zealand, right? The perpetrator of that terrorist attack written a manifesto which claimed that that the environment has to be protected for white people against foreigners, right? In Australia, New Zealand, and the Western world. So here we found this document which actually rather kind of totally destabilized the idea of, let's say, this being a conflict only about taking land, right? The climate sort of enters into the conflict here. But using a kind of racist ideology, right? That says that, like, that Germans are a nature-loving people, and therefore they are on the side of nature. And when the battle comes, nature will be called to take the side of Germans. However, what we were able to show in kind of our analysis of this map, based on the information that we know today, or know of the history today, is that the same network of forests and climatic lines also included the concentration camps of the Holocaust, right? In most, or if not all cases, the camps were always very close to or inside forests. And part of the work that we show here was a case where the very first concentration camp of the Holocaust, Helmno nad Nerem, is where sort of methods of hiding the evidence of mass killing included using a secret reforestation program where bones of victims would be turned into fertilizer to plant new birch and pine forests, near the site of the mass graves. So here there was something which is not something we were after at the beginning, but rather that it emerged that, in fact, if we close that equation, right, between settler colonialism, resource exploitation, and environmental racism, you might end up with genocide, right? So a key kind of political claim, right, that I think is very much operative in the work we do is around the question of environmental justice. So what I'd like to do next is to a little bit unpack and bring this history in much more palpable terms to the present, right? And the kind of the idea there is that what we're dealing with is in the fight against environmental racism, environmental justice must come to work, and that the question of an environmental racism opens up to a new field, right, of a struggle for social justice. So it is not a coincidence that we switch from this image to this one. So in the last image, what I think was really powerful, right, is that we showed what was, let's say, invisible in that map of a climate conflict in occupied Poland, which was the location of the concentration camps. Similarly, and we used, the sort of methodology, right, or what we were following was rather one of making maps, of a kind of spatial distribution and sort of geographical kind of investigative kind of approach, right? Maps are a kind of frontier in that sense, or maps are a kind of tool, of course. The work of Robert Bullard is very instructive here, because he's sort of often referred to as a person that coined the term environmental racism, right, and environmental justice. And this comes from Robert Bullard's work in Houston in the 60s and the 70s and in the 80s, where Robert Bullard sort of and his research colleagues and students showed that how in fact in Houston, which was a city in the 70s that was going through a period of boom because of the oil, you know, that was sort of flowing, that was sort of being sort of extracted in Texas at the time, right? Created a kind of explosion of the urban sort of context. The city was growing, right? But what Bullard was, what showed in this groundbreaking research, which included sort of also map making, was that all of the state-controlled or the city-controlled sort of waste dumps of Houston were located in either black or Hispanic neighborhoods, right? What Bullard showed simultaneously that the private companies that were given some of those contracts, all those plants were also located in either black or Hispanic neighborhoods, right? So here at this moment, right, we kind of have an additional sort of an expansion of a kind of concept of social justice, right, where the environment kind of enters, right, where let's say inequality that could be traced across, let's say, class, you know, moves to race, right, and connects to the environment, to the question of a right to a healthy place, a right to an environment, right. So in this case, you know, as the image here shows, that in fact this Whispering Pines landfill was very close to sort of, you know, black communities and schools and so on. A research that was done then following this work of Bullard expanded this to actually show that this wasn't an isolated case at all. That in fact, you know, across the United States, in the southern United States, right, you know, which were slave-owning kind of you know, sort of states, there were very many examples where toxic waste and sort of municipal waste from factories, from companies and so on were being dumped in black and Hispanic neighborhoods. And we can see, for example, here in the red, you know, generally the location of Houston, right? This is in the 80s. This is a recent report from the journalist group INTERPRT, and which shows that in what is known as the kind of the cancer mile in Louisiana, where there are very many you know, locations of sort of chemical waste, chemical companies. A lot of these chemical companies' waste is dumped again in sort of African American sort of cities and neighborhoods. Here in this case, Mossville was actually a town that was founded by a freed slave, and this town, according to this research investigation from INTERPRT, shows how those narratives of a toxic geography, right, are nevertheless continue. I mean, this is just one example of many journalistic sort of you know, sort of reports and work that has gone into this. I thought I'd show you kind of a relationship, right? That this is not something that just happened in the past, you know. However, what was happening at the same time was that there was resistance. This is an image of people protesting against the Whispering Pines toxic dump in North Carolina. There was resistance in the 70s and the 80s, where black church leaders and many other sort of civil rights groups began to also include environmental justice in kind of demands of equal rights from the civil rights movement, so racial justice and so on, right? So these links are sort of coalescing at this moment. You know, in 1968, this is a very important sort of protest. this, predating a little bit to the story, to where we were in Houston and North Carolina, is a protest that was in Memphis, Tennessee, where garbage workers who were all black were fighting for better pay and better rights, especially after when 2 of their worker colleagues were killed, right? So this is in 1968, and this protest, this is the protest that brought Martin Luther King to Memphis, right? And after which he's shot. And we sort of see a kind of militarized kind of a moment, right, where the National Guard is sort of, you know, there to face off against sort of peaceful protesters. Larry Payne, who was a 16-year-old African-American boy, was shot by the police, which remains a kind of landmark moment for where let's say the civil rights movement sort of connects to the environmental justice movement. But I also want to point to, let's say, the power of the images, right, or that was sort of really operative here at this moment, which is that in the Memphis garbage workers sort of struggle, I am man, what became a kind of slogan, right, that they were literally, you know, wearing as they're protesting. And this was, again, not a coincidence, because this was also a kind of abolitionist, right, slogan that was very much used in order to, the abolitionists used in order to sort of end slavery, you know, in Great Britain in the 18th century. So there's a kind of relationship, right, that we can trace, you know, just through this one kind of trajectory, if you'd like, where we can trace, let's say, you know, kind of the roots of the civil rights movement to ending slavery, but also to environmental justice and environmental racism, right? But I wanted to also show this, these 2 images for another reason, which is that, which is around law, and this is where we're going to sort of approach to our next, you know, perhaps the next part of my talk, which is that at the time of slavery, the idea that slavery would end was unthinkable, right? This was around the world the status quo, you know, state-supported sort of business, you know. However, the abolitionists were able to actually use, at the time when when there were no, you know, circulation of images as a kind of a message, right? They were actually able to use, you know, this sort of print, and this became widely used by the abolitionist movement from the civil society side to show that you know, another kind of world was possible, right? That it was possible to end slavery, and in fact, you know, this work led to finally to the end of slavery in Great Britain. This doesn't mean that everything is solved, obviously, but you know, I want to just kind of point to this moment of let's say a win, right, for let's say a justice sort of focused movement. And I want to move from here to, let's say, thinking about where we are today, right? What is kind of our political claims of doing this work that we're doing today? What is the claims of behind that, you know, the exhibition upstairs, and so on? And this is about fighting impunity, right? By this I mean where there's absence of justice. By impunity I mean where crimes are allowed to continue without the victims having any recourse to justice, right? By impunity I also mean a state of affairs where a crime is not recognized as a crime, right, for specific kinds of environmental destruction at the time of, let's say, the climate emergency. And this And by this impunity, the state of impunity, I mean the missing crime of ecocide. At the moment, the 4 crimes that are recognized, that are very much steeped in the blood that was spilled and the millions that died in the Second World War, you know, and that period of 20th century history was also the beginning of international justice, right? You know, 2 crimes, genocide and crimes against humanity, did not exist until this moment. That sort of forever sort of changed the landscape of international criminal justice. However, in the 21st century, where we face climate emergency, where we have never more powerful states and corporations wreaking havoc on the planet and sort of acting without having any sense of being held accountable, we are saying that there's a missing crime, the missing crime of ecocide. And this is the work that sort of drives this is sort of like the moral imperative, if you'd like, that drives the work that work we do. And I'd like to now sort of share with you or to bring some examples of how we do this, you know, of how we can fight impunity, and whether through our investigative work, but also through the advocacy work that we do. So we draw, being an architecture group, we draw maps. And this, for example, is a map that we're constantly drawing on and drawing upon and drawing with. This is a map of the Pacific, a place where we often work, and voices from where we wish to amplify. And this map shows how the Pacific continues to this day, a site where hundreds of nuclear weapons were tested, a place where vast amounts of minerals are exploited, but also a place which is today, especially for the low-lying Pacific Island states, face the existential threat of sea level rise and losing their land and their culture and so on, right? So, so in a way, this map is sort of like redrawing the Pacific as a site of ecocide, right? So we work in very specific contexts in some of these locations, some of these places, a few of which I'll discuss today. But again, as we saw in the example of the social justice and civil rights and environmental justice movement that fought by the African American communities and their allies and in the United States, responses to so let's say nuclear colonialism of the United Kingdom, the United States, and France, for example, did not go unanswered. And to this day, there are places, right, where there's radiation, as you can probably imagine, right, that you know means that these places are impossible for people to live. For example, in the Marshall Islands, for thousands of years to come, where communities can never go back to the places which they call home. But today, that violence of, let's say, of nuclear colonialism in the Pacific also translates to climate justice. So the younger generation, right, you know, of activists. This, for example, is an example of Pacific Island students fighting for climate change. We're based at in Port Vila in Vanuatu, where I was a visiting academic at the University of South Pacific there in the summer. Sort of shows that the students there, for example, are also using international law in a kind of fight to fight climate change, right? So these students, for example, are part of a movement that is trying to get the International Court of Justice to look at the responsibility of states, what responsibility states have in order to protect their citizens from climate change, right? But one question that I often ask myself in doing this work is that we often hear this term, right? Fighting climate change, right? However, climate change cannot necessarily be fought. It is rather a climatic or rather a scientific description of the state of affairs, of injustice, if you'd like. And the word I would rather use there is rather fighting a kind of ecological impunity, right? And by this I mean that as brave and amazing, and I've met and worked with a number of the students, you know, who are in this, who are proudly kind of showing their climate justice banner in this image. As brave, as strong, and as courageous, you know, as they might be, the forces that they're fighting are also very powerful, right? You know, what produces states of impunity here is, for example, the fact that a company like Shell, which is a British, Dutch, one of the biggest oil companies in the world, as an example of, let's say, other really big oil companies in the world, have known for a really long time, you know, what the impacts of their industry can cause to the destruction of the climate, right? They've also since then been supporting climate denier groups in all over the world. And they're not held accountable, partly because it might be easy to say, well, Shell is to blame for climate change, you know, because we work in the context of international criminal justice. To actually prove this in, let's say, a criminal context becomes extremely complicated for a number of reasons. Why? One might be that while there are many civil cases today, you know, to deal with, let's say, to hold, let's say, corporations accountable for climate change, there've not been a criminal attempt, right? Partly because the crime does not exist, but also in criminal justice, the threshold of evidence that's required to connect victim to perpetrator and to the site of the crime is complex, right? It also becomes diffused. So it isn't the case where there's a bullet fired from one location that hits, you know, someone in the back of the room here, right? And we have to figure out, you know, what was the path of that bullet, right? And who fired it, right? It's rather a case of a diffused responsibility, right? Where let's say for decades, you know, oil companies might be extracting oil in one place, you know, then polluting the atmosphere, not only in a local context, but also in a global context, you know, which then triggers a kind of a domino effect, right? That weakens, let's say, kind of environmental regimes, and let's say leads to bigger storms and a higher sea level, and then impacts a group of people that might be on the other side of the world, right? So there's a kind of complex causality that I think a kind of forensics for ecocide must be attuned to and must sort of work towards. And I'd like to sort of show a couple of examples of the work we're doing precisely in this area. The idea of the front line, similarly in climate, in kind of the discourse on climate justice, is a very powerful one, right? The idea of the front line being, let's say, you know, communities that are living, you know, let's say in a small island Pacific state, might be at the front line of climate change, that they're fighting climate change, as we saw with the image of the group of Pacific Island students from Vanuatu. However, in this reconceptualization of, let's say, you know, going after the climate criminals, right, we must also rethink what that front line is, right? Rather than the front line being a linear kind of idea of, let's say, the front-facing kind of a, you know, space, it is also a kind of a topological kind of relationship, right? Where the front line could be, you know, oscillating back and forth, you know, between vastly different geographies, right? So in this case, to take the oil company Shell, they've been one of the places of great sort of violence that they've been operating on is in Ogoniland in Nigeria. And this is a place where in this fight against climate impunity or ecological impunity, you know, we must sort of extend the idea of the front line to places of extraction, right? Not only the places where, let's say, the impacts of climate change are being felt. So Shell has been operating in Nigeria since the 1950s, and in Ogoniland, you know, sort of, you know, so big groups, human rights groups like Amnesty International have been reporting on the human rights violations that have been related to let's say Shell and the Nigerian state. However, in the work that we're doing, we've been able to work. We're working with a social movement organization in Ogoniland, the Movement for the Survival of the Ogoni People, that was founded by the Ogoni writer and activist Ken Saro-Wiwa in the 90s, in order to build a platform where we can support their advocacy efforts by showing sort of mapping the extent of the oil pollution, right? By using sort of satellite-based satellite imagery analysis, right? So so this is kind of like a first step, right, where we're actually working with a community group, but in a way where we can kind of use our forensic techniques in order to produce an advocacy tool. This, for example, is an image from a workshop that we did in London with members of Mossab, where we were validating some of the data that we'd collected, you know, with them. I'd like to now show you a couple of minutes of a work in progress of the platform. So we'll give you an idea. Let's say the three areas which the research has been looking into, which is one is to locate, make an up-to-date database of the oil pollution. Second is the impact on mangrove that are very important to the ecology of the area. And third is beginning to look at tracing atmospheric pollution. One thing to bear in mind that in Ogoniland, which is on the southern sort of delta of Nigeria, at the moment or since the 90s, because of the resistance of the Ogoni people, there have not been oil exploitation done within their territory. However, their territory sort of sits at a very important logistical sort of point in the oil economy of global oil economy. Nigeria's oil flows through their land, and so the pipelines that flow through their land are vital to this. And this has been part of the sort of the context in which this environmental violence has wreaked so much havoc in this place.
INTERPRT has been working on behalf of the Movement for the Survival of the Ogoni People to gather up-to-date spatial evidence of the impacts of long-term oil pollution on the southern Niger Delta. First, we conducted a site analysis to map settlements, roads, public services, water bodies, oil infrastructure, and water wells, among others. Shell maintains a large network of crumbling oil infrastructure and pipelines that crisscross the Ogoni territory, which continues to enrich the company and the Nigerian state while perpetuating ecological harm and human rights violations for the Ogoni people. We use the United Nations Environment Programme survey data and our own satellite imagery analysis to identify and map this toxic infrastructure in order to better understand the sources of pollution. Large sections of pipelines lie above ground and dangerously close to people's homes. Here is a photograph of a section that runs from Eleme Petrochemical Company through Okirika town. Next, we mapped all available data on oil spills covering a period from 1985 to the present day to produce an up-to-date oil spill database. We used available oil spill quantity in barrels to produce a heat map and visualize the areas with a higher amount of hydrocarbons spilled on or near human settlements. Here we show the distance of settlements from pipelines at the range of 50 to 1,000 meters. This project is particularly map-based because satellite imagery analysis is at the core of the work we've done. Niger Delta's mangrove forest is one of the most ecologically sensitive regions in the world. Mangroves are an integral part of the Ogoni people's livelihood and culture. Remote sensing algorithms are a powerful tool that can be used to measure vegetation health. Landsat time series analysis using NDVI shows approximately 30,000 hectares of mangroves have been lost between 1986 to the present. Yellow indicates highly degraded vegetation, water, or built-up areas. 2019 vegetation health analysis shows an entire forest in an alarming state. This is indicated in red. Mangrove forests provide crucial ecosystem services to local communities. They also represent the habitat and breeding area for a wide diversity of fish species. No less important, mangroves, as all other intertidal ecosystems, provide natural protection against climate change. The troposphere is the lowest region of the atmosphere, extending from the Earth's surface to a height of about 10 kilometers. Gas flares, oil refineries, fire from blowouts, and evaporation of volatile hydrocarbons from spills all contribute to air pollution over Ogoni land. We used freely available data from Tropomi on board the Copernicus Sentinel-5 satellite to quantify hydrocarbon-related air pollution in Ogoni land. We looked at the presence of 5 chemicals that can be byproducts of fossil fuel production and emission: carbon monoxide, aerosol, formaldehyde, sulfur dioxide, and nitrogen dioxide. Here is an example of nitrogen dioxide over Ogoni territory. All of the pollutants were found to be in higher concentration in Ogoni land and its vicinity, especially in the Bonny Island refineries and Port Harcourt, the major urban area. These chemicals, acting in combination, are causing serious adverse effects on human health. From the underground to the atmosphere, Ogoni land is a territory under full-spectrum contamination.
So the work in Ogoni land, as we were sort of, as I was sort of explaining before, cannot be seen without the context of a larger network of a potential criminal enterprise, right? Where, let's say, the places of extraction must be related also to the places of impact, right? Both locally but also globally, given that this is very much how the climate operates. In criminal terms, this involves better understanding, right? You know, what is known as the act, to the state of mind, the consequences, and their context. So it is not enough just to have one of the two. A criminal act must be in relationship to the state of mind of the criminal, right? In very classic sort of criminology terms, this might be the intention, right? So the intention to harm somebody, you know, is something that is an operative of a criminal act. However, in the context of, let's say, environmental destruction, it might not be as much a question of intent, but also a question of knowing that your actions could have a negative impact, but not doing anything about it. You know, especially if profit is a motive, right? In a kind of neoliberal sort of capitalist sort of system, right? So the work on, let's say, the intentionality and the state of mind of, let's say, big oil, you know, has been looked at by groups such as the report Smoke and Fumes from the International Environmental Law Center for International Environmental Law, where they showed how big oil had sort of known for a very long time the consequences of what their industry sort of, what they can have on the climate. So we must be able to sort of link, right, these seemingly separate pieces of evidence, right, towards building up a more complete picture. So for this, I want to show you a piece of research that we've been doing, where we've been looking at the concept of what I call a new kind of environmental forensics, which is around attribution, right, where it's possible to make connections and make links between, let's say, specific events or moments of climate change, and link them to specific activities of, let's say, big oil, right? So this is a crucial link that was actually missing up until fairly recently in kind of, climate science sort of work, right? So there's much more to be done, but this is kind of a new field which we're exploring, and where we can begin to, let's say, make links between, let's say, the impact, the causal links, if you'd like.
Storm tracks of major cyclones in the South Pacific from 1992 to 2018 show a pattern in the increase of intensity of cyclone strength at a rate of about 9 kilometers per hour per decade. Cyclone Wilma was the first storm to still be classed as a tropical cyclone by the time it struck New Zealand, with 10-minute sustained wind speeds of up to 185 kilometers per hour. Cyclone Winston was the most intense tropical cyclone in the Southern Hemisphere on record, with 10-minute sustained wind speeds of 280 kilometers per hour. Record-breaking sustained winds of 300 kilometers per hour were observed over Koro Island in Fiji. Cyclone Donna was the most powerful off-season Southern Hemisphere cyclone ever recorded in the month of May, with 10-minute sustained wind speeds of up to 205 kilometers per hour. While influenced by many factors, heat from the sea surface is a primary source of energy for cyclone formation. Warmer sea surface temperatures will increase the probability of stronger cyclones forming. Sea surface temperature in Cyclone Pam's trajectory over the Western Pacific region in March 2015 indicated that it was well above average.
So consider these as building blocks, right, towards a new kind of climate crime investigation, where, let's say, places of impact can be connected to their consequences, to specific changes in extreme weather or sea level rise in relationship to, let's say, the amount of the impact, let's say certain. The biggest oil companies might be contributing to towards this, right? Now it's important to remember that what we're saying isn't that, let's say, the Cyclone Pam, which we were speaking about here, is caused by, let's say, climate change or oil activities of a specific oil company. That would be going too far. What we are potentially saying is that what was not possible before is to make these links much more palpable, right? To make a link to say that, let's say, cyclone intensity, is, if that is driven by rising temperature in the ocean, can be then linked to the contribution of, let's say, specific oil companies to that rise in the temperature, right? So it is not a direct causal link, but nevertheless, there begins to be a totally new way of sort of reorganizing, let's say, what could be a case in a future legal forum. I'd like to sort of end by sort of speaking about this idea of the forum, right? In the exhibition upstairs, one of the really powerful sort of out of many astonishing things is that the case that the Polish state was this is the Polish state that was in power right after the end of the Second World War. You know, what they were able to do was to amass 8,000 cases against the Germans, right? And the place where they brought this was the forum that they were working towards, was the United Nations War Crimes Commission. So at this time, the UN does not exist yet. The UN War Crimes Commission, in fact, predates the United Nations. And this was a totally radically different forum where the, you know, states that were already, sometimes in exile, you know, were already preparing cases or gathering evidence of, let's say, the crimes of the Axis powers, right? So in a way, this forum is sort of like the grandmother of all kind of international criminal justice forums, of which the one we have today is the International Criminal Court, right? So it's not enough, I suppose, to just gather evidence, not have anywhere to go with it or do anything with it. So sometimes when you don't have that perfect forum, you know, people get together and try to make that happen, right? You know, civil society gets together and organizes alternative forums, or works towards changing, you know, the forums that people feel that could be useful, a place to try to look for justice, right? So, so again, you know, we work very much in the Pacific, as we've sort of demonstrated a little bit, but we're also working with Pacific Island states as part of a bigger campaign to recognize ecocide as an international crime. And at the moment, you know, part of the work is also to support the leadership of, let's say, Pacific Island states and civil society there to lobby and to actually advocate for recognition of ecocide as an international crime. So the state that we're working with at the moment on this is the government of Vanuatu and a number of other sort of friendly allies. This is a movement that is very much, or this work was very much started by the Scottish lawyer Polly Higgins, who very much revived the ecocide debate, you know, in order to sort of address impunity and injustice in times of climate change. But this work in her absence continues amongst a number of groups which we're part of. Do I have a few minutes to show a last final piece? Yeah. Okay. Thanks. I'd like to end now, before we sort of open up to hopefully a discussion amongst us, a short explainer video that we made for another exhibition at the Dhaka Art Summit that just took place earlier in February, where we sort of distilled, let's say, the campaign on ecocide. And I think this is it's very short, it's about 3 minutes long, but I think kind of sums up, let's say, where ecocide was and where we want to go with it, right? And perhaps show its contemporary relevance. The work we've done here with the Biennale Warsaw for Race and Forest exhibition is you will notice that it's not mentioned there. But that's because this origins of ecocide is a topic I think that is that we're taking very, very, very seriously, and there's a number of trajectories to this research which we're sort of in the process of exploring and working on. So we're doing the investigative work, which is sort of like the core of our sort of forensic kind of work. But the advocacy work, as just to go back to the beginning of my talk, is connected to also this historical and theoretical sort of conceptual research that we undertake, coming from, let's say, visual culture and architecture and sort of to some extent art contexts. So the setting legal precedents of the attempts at prosecution for environmental crimes is one of these trajectories. We're part of an exhibition that will be also at MSN at Panska Street that opens in the 21st of March, where we're sort of working on sort of bringing together some of the other trajectories for this very kind of long-term intensive research. I hope you get a little bit of a taste for that, because those other two trajectories are very much about civil society mobilization, right? But also about the life of the law, like where ecocide as a crime, you know, where do we trace it in the history of international criminal justice? So along with the legal precedents of the existing attempts at prosecution, the three points together produce a kind of a body of research, which we might call Center for Ecocide Studies. So I'd like to end with a short video that sort of that we made that explains this broader aim of making ecocide international crime, and then it'd be great to open up to questions and also to have a conversation with Bartek and Philip, who's part of our group, and Ella and others.
Climate emergency has gripped the planet that disproportionately impacts the global south. Bangladesh is among one of the most severely vulnerable to climate change. The country's coastal areas are under greater risk today than ever before. At a global scale, treaties such as the COP that focuses on emissions are not working, or worse, designed to fail. International criminal law can be an effective tool for climate justice to hold those most responsible to account. But under the current laws, the International Criminal Court can only investigate 4 crimes: genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the crimes of aggression. Ecocide, or crimes against the environment, is not yet recognized. The term ecocide isn't new. It was coined to describe the widespread use of herbicides, such as Agent Orange, by the United States during the Vietnam War.
The immense destruction brought about by indiscriminate bombing, by large-scale use of bulldozers and herbicides, is an outrage, sometimes described as ecocide, which requires urgent international attention.
In the 1990s, the International Law Commission included environmental destruction in the draft code of crimes against the peace and security of mankind. Its adopted version, known as the Rome Statute, which created the International Criminal Court, only recognizes environmental destruction if as part of a war crime. But what about widespread and severe environmental harm when it takes place in peacetime?
All it requires is an amendment to a document called the Rome Statute. And the Rome Statute governs the 4 existing crimes against peace.
In 2010, the barrister Polly Higgins submitted an amendment proposal to the United Nations on the crime of ecocide as a peacetime crime. Higgins went on to found the Stop Ecocide campaign with the environmental activist Jojo Mehta, whose aim is to raise global awareness and make ecocide an international crime by introducing it through an amendment to the Rome Statute. When enacted, it would allow the investigation of individuals and prosecution if found guilty of ecocide. Under the Rome Statute, adoption of a proposed amendment is by 2/3 majority vote of the Assembly of State Parties, the governing body of the ICC. The campaign participates in this key forum to support and amplify the voices of climate frontline member states. Ecocide has started getting wider traction as the environmental movement has gone mainstream. Groups such as the Extinction Rebellion have included ecocide in their demands. Pope Francis recently recognized the term, and Brazil's President Bolsonaro has been accused widely for causing ecocide and allowing for the raging fires in the Amazon. Powerful countries in the global north are unlikely to champion ecocide. In fact, in the 1990s, during the deliberations on the Rome Statute, environmental destruction as a standalone crime was opposed by the United States, United Kingdom, and the Netherlands. It is up to climate frontline states and civil society to take the lead.
The Assembly of State Parties is supremely well positioned to help realize this potential. Most notably, an amendment of the Rome Statute could criminalize acts that amount to ecocide. We believe this radical idea merits serious consideration.
Thanks.
Thank you, Nabil, for this wonderful lecture, and it's a good moment for questions or commentaries, and to open the forum and and start discussion.
Maybe I will start with the question and comment. So my name is Marcin, and I am ecological anthropologist trained at the University of Warsaw, so just to clear my position. And you started this presentation with discussion on ecofascism, which recently got pretty discussed idea, and there was like really nice article recently about avocado politics, which are green from the outside, but they are brown on the inside. And in this article, like, there's a sort of accusation against the climate activists, or generally like a green movement, that they assumed, like a lot of public speakers also assumed that ecology, like treating ecology seriously, comes like in a package with progressive politics. So once we make people believe that, okay, the climate emergency is real, they will adopt the progressive politics. But in the recent years, it turns out that it's not necessarily the thing, that people can treat ecological crisis seriously and respond to it with a very even radically right-wing responses. And in this context, like, my question would be, from your perspective as also like person advocating, how can we change our discourse? How can we speak as activists, as academics, as people fighting for climate justice? How can we oppose those tendencies, and how should we speak about climate justice to make it like real justice?
Does anybody else have any comments on that? I mean, it's a very broad, broad question, but no, I mean, I mean, absolutely. I totally follow you. I mean, in a way, this has been very much operative. Well, even yesterday, we kind of realized that if you've seen the exhibition, this very first map that I showed had the quotes on the right-hand side, which are pretty crazy, but it didn't really say where the quotes are from. Like, you kind of have to look a little bit, inside the exhibition space to see the source. So we had a friend who sort of thought that it was our kind of comments. After reading a few lines, he's just like, no, they really can't mean that, and then he found the source, then he was like, oh, okay, it was just a crazy Nazi from the past, So yeah, I mean, there's not only this, but there's also very recent accusations, right? That like group like Extinction Rebellion are very white, for instance, or if you look at a little bit earlier in a kind of history of environmental history, right? The ideas of wilderness and protecting parks and all of this, let's say in the American, kind of West and so on, have actually kept people out, Native Americans and so on. So I mean, I think these are tensions that they're not going to just go away, you know. So so I think here it is, no. Like one is that this idea of intersectionality, right? Like I mean, I think just because eco-fascists can say that, well, we need to protect our great nature, land, and so on, and kick everybody out, you know, doesn't mean that you know the progressive, you know, groups shouldn't kind of counter that, right? By saying that actually, you know, like the Polish state, for example, is very, you know, goes against LGBT rights, you know, but at the same time they going. It's like they all come hand in hand, you know. They also go against, you know, the environment, right? So I think that message of intersectionality is really kind of important, and not necessarily. I mean, we have like our really specific places to fight from, but we have to find ways of kind of connecting to. You know, issues of race and gender and class and so on, right? To give you another example, in some of the Pacific work we've been doing, so far we've worked mainly kind of using maps and so on, right? Apparently very big scale, you know, but we have allies and colleagues who work very close to the ground. So, you know, excuse me, if it's not possible for us to go, and for myself, for us to go, to sort of do really kind of community level work, you know, we have to build trust amongst different groups working to be able to kind of come together, you know. So I mean, that's just like a concrete, kind of like an example of that we're kind of working through. And I think lastly, it's to be like always. Like I think it's Michel Foucault who sort of says that like there's a kind of that we can be like you know, we can become fascist at any moment, right? Like the term isn't only kept for you know, swastika, you know, wielding, you know, Nazis or something like this. So if fighting kind of like this microfascism, right? Like, you know, and I think this is where, you know, like the arts, like theater and art and so on, it can really, you know, keep us away from that abyss in many ways.
Thank you very much. This is really very, very interesting. I was particularly, I mean, in a way I expected it, but it was your examples from the US and the kind of brutal combination of you know, race and ecocide are really shocking. And of course, there's more to it in the sense that you could also probably combine it with the prison industrial complex and the way people of color are also exploited, continue to be exploited in the US. And my question actually, I mean, was partly answered by you when you mentioned intersectionality, that I was actually specifically going to ask about, and to ask about, I mean, it's not just an idea, it's something that you have to implement. And I was wondering, that perhaps thinking about ways in the US context, ways in which, for example, feminists, Native Americans have been among the early groups that have addressed environmental justice and the environment. Perhaps kind of rewriting the history of ecological movements in such a way that you actually claim those or address them as the forerunners of the movement, not to have kind of, you know, white men speaking again for everybody else, and to maybe think about ways in which like all movements. I'm sure there's a relationship between what you're doing and the civil rights movement, just as the LGBTQ movements in the US have been largely patterned on the civil rights movement. These are just ideas about how to actually build some bridges by acknowledging those relationships. So this is kind of a general comment, since you already mentioned intersectionality.
No, I totally follow you. I mean, I would just sort of actually have a question to the audience, right? Which is that in let's say in a Polish or East European or European kind of context, right? What is being done, or how is this intersectionality kind of working? Let's say to bring questions of not just gender, but also class and race. Because as I think as we're kind of like taking this journey across time and space, we saw that like these issues, I mean, they're not random. There's patterns, that can be traced even, even though we were not after this. We found this, in the history of the, what we've shown upstairs, so. Because otherwise it's like I mean I speak to it's like I'm from Bangladesh, like I never really kind of intended to sort of use kind of identity as a way to kind of mark the work I do, but I'm increasingly feeling like I should be, because a lot of the places where I go, where I'm speaking about these topics, I'm the only person of color in a lot of these kind of events, and I mean it's not really something that I'm kind of. I mean, I moved to the West in order to become as close as I could to to be. I mean, I lived in the United States for many years to sort of to fit in and to get on, and but it seems that we're kind of at a precipice, where these things become really like kind of battlefields or frontiers, So yeah, I guess. Sorry, just to kind of go back to the question that I had for you and anyone else, which is that how are these being addressed here? But I mean, the whole kind of violence and the whole kind of story around migrants coming into Europe, right? Which is again, I mean, again, the idea isn't that that we can trace everything to environment or climate, but I mean, people coming here from parts of Africa, even if there's not a conflict going on, which there is, like it has everything to do with climate, So what has been kind of, I mean, Poland is not a kind of frontline state in that sense as Hungary might be, but how do people kind of see, right, like, groups that are fighting for or supporting kind of migrant justice here? Do they make links to with climate activists here? I don't know, or are there this? And if I can just add one more thing, again, like is the issue of class, because it's so steeped in kind of ideas of Marxism and communism and so on. Like, how do people address, because those, I don't know, maybe I'm saying too broad things, but like they haven't gone away. It's not like all of those challenges have been, but like. I'm not one of them, but there's other colleagues who work very much in the context of like, let's say, you know, Marxism and environmental justice, you know, which, you know, how do people talk about that here?
I'm actually, my field of expertise, if any, is the US and queer studies and African American history and culture. So this is why I asked you about the US and the kind of intersectionality that could be practiced in the context of those examples that you were raising. But in Poland, I think that race is just, from my experience of teaching in Poland, race is the most problematic, or it's like, you know, people have no clue about, I think, about that. And but I think that I think we're beginning to recognize that ways in which environmental justice is related to the, I don't know, the fate of the Polish farmers that are really struggling to survive under, you know, the changing conditions. We're beginning to recognize class and the kind of exploitation that has been part of Polish history, but this is only, I think it's only the beginning of kind of an emerging, if not Marxist, then leftist consciousness. So I'm not the best person. Since you were looking at me, I feel that I should answer. But maybe you guys who work on this would know more.
Hi. It feels kind of weird to be speaking with a microphone. But anyway, I just wanted to say, I mean, I have this feeling that indeed we might not be using the term climate justice. It's not that mainstream at this point. However, I think this realization emerges, you know, at the same time on different fronts. I mean, one example is the actually Manifa march that's tomorrow. That's actually dedicated to climate and feminism. Another is the Fridays for Future. That's, at least in Poland, has seen massive, actually, marches multiple times, which I think is absolutely impressive. I think another, actually, dimension to this issue of climate justice that I would love personally to see being discussed more, and that is actually just transition. I can say, that's a disclaimer here, that my organization is one of those that actually work on just transition in this part of the world, in Central Eastern Europe, in Poland specifically, in Silesia, and that is about communities and miners that are affected by these, by the changes that tackling the climate crisis actually entails. And I feel this is a massively important development in the sense that we are maybe trying to foster solidarity. You know, we're starting from the very basic of maybe, you know, environmental climate defenders that work with miners, miner unions, communities, and I hope, you know, this will grow.
Yeah, it's great to hear. Yeah.
So I can also have a comment, yeah, maybe some comment from the insights of at least some of the protest movements that were happening in Poland. And in general, like, it will be more, I will try to address your questions in a maybe more analytical way. Because one thing you asked about was racism, and I'm also quite on the same page with you that it's like really underestimated and poorly understood topic in Poland. But there are also like certain reasons for this, historical and social reasons. Because like first thing, and this is like why I also have like a bit of a problem with actually talking about racism in Poland and using the lens of, for example, the discussion about racism in the United States. Because like one key difference is that in the United States, there are like a lot of different communities, and they are like very embedded, like also historically embedded in the society. In case of Poland, throughout last 70 years after the Second World War, Poland was basically monoethnic country, one of the most monoethnic countries in the world, in fact, like comparable to Japan. Like after all the changes with the borders and all the genocides and basically all the legacy of the Second World War. So there's the one thing, and it's like something that changes right now, and it's like really got more, like the society, it's getting more culturally rich, but it's like very recent change. And obviously we have the historical legacy of multi-ethnicity, of like Polish and Jewish relations and so on. We have also the history of anti-Semitism. But because of the position of Poland as a victim of the Second World War, this discourse of pre-war Polish anti-Semitism and also colonialism, because there were also like Poland wanted to have colonies. It's not like that. It was like not existing idea in the political circles in Poland, but it was never really discussed in a way that it was discussed in the West, like the consequences of this sort of thinking. So there's like a really long, so it's like really weird situation we are right now, that we have like certain things not discussed at all throughout like 70 years, and now we're entering a new, like not really now, but it's like last 20 years or 30 years when Poland is entering this really different, like international, multi-ethnic reality, like reality of like late capitalism and globalization. So it's, yeah, so it's one reason why this term of race is like tricky in a way. And speaking of class, I think like at least in certain circles, like the terms of Marxist analysis are quite strong also in Poland. So at least in the academia, it's not anymore like a taboo to do this kind of analysis. But on the very practical level, in practice of the movements, I feel like there's like really, and like it was seen, for example, in Białowieża forest. Yeah, there's like a very sharp class conflict because the activists are usually, you know, upper middle class people coming from the cities, and the local community. For example, in case of Białowieża, it has like a very long history of actually people from the outside deciding about their fates, and like, you know, like the discussion, for example, like discussion about nature protection in this region was, and largely still is, the discussion between groups of experts. So there's like a government side group of experts, there is, let's say, social side, but it's also like group, like university group of experts, and you know, and they are discussing between each other about the fate of the region, and the people from the region are not really involved on the side of the conflict, and they're really frustrated with it. They're really, really angry, and the anger, in this case, very often manifests actually into the leaning to the right-wing politics, which creates like a tension also between the activists and the local groups, and also in this Polish context, it's really hard for the activists to grasp the common language with the people, even though the problems are recognizable by both sides. For example, the problems with drought, the problems of farmers, yeah, they're somehow discussed, But there is, I think, still like a lot of mistrust and a lot of class conflict actually happening between the activists on the one hand and the local groups on the other hand. So that's my comment. Maybe someone will argue or have different opinion on this issue.
I will not argue on that particular issue, though I have a question, and I have a question regarding governance. The ICC today is unfortunately not really recognized by many of the major countries due to the fact that they will have their own, let's say, part of the citizens prosecuted already today, such as the US and the UK and so on. Even if I think the mission is honorable in order to get the ecocide part of the ICC, even if we get it in there, do you really foresee a huge difference considering that the ICC today is not really recognized as it should be?
So yeah, I mean, these are questions that a lot of us are thinking about very, very intensively. We can even add more, which is to say that the ICC's record has been far from great because they've been seen to go after African warlords and things like this. You know, so I just want to add that to what you said. I mean, having said that, in its defense, it's young still. It is far from perfect, but it is considered the court of last resort, right? It's not a forum where you just go with any issue, right? What took to actually get most countries in the world to sign up to the Rome Statute is, I mean, I've spoken to some of the people that have drafted it, you know. It's nothing less than a miracle to actually have. This would not be possible now, you know. This happened it was even possible partly because if we look at the very early moments of the UN, like you know, what we might call like a honeymoon period, right? It's like the countries that were victors in the Second World War, you know, none of their crimes were addressed, right? First of all, and they did what seemingly was like a victor's justice in Nuremberg and Tokyo and so on. However, when the UN, you know, was beginning to say that, like, well, we want to have something like, you know, International Criminal Court or a law that's going to protect people against genocide and so on, these countries kind of like the United States were champions at that time of these ideas because they, you know, and they also couldn't go away from it because, you know, it was so fresh. They'd just done Nuremberg. They couldn't just turn around and say, well, actually, it doesn't apply to us. You know, I mean, you know, so there was support, you know, but where we are today is I think, look, I mean, the court has turned around its previous judgment on the Afghanistan case. The idea is that there will be an investigation. First time in the history that you know that an international court, no less than the International Criminal Court, is going to open an investigation against the United States. This has never happened before. So then in itself, we must kind of take that as some kind of a small step, right? So on the question of the big countries not signing up, I mean, the International Criminal Court is not for the big countries. It's actually for the smaller guys, you know. So of course there will be the tension, right? Like, well, not everybody signs up, what you do, but like, the court is for, you know, smaller countries that are not as powerful. I mean, the Russians are not going to sign up to this, you know, but for instance, you know, but like, or the Americans, but yeah, I mean, that has been the idea, that like, if lots of small countries kind of, you know, join up, then it can do something. Finally, it is not a court that has, you know, an army or police or anything. It depends on cooperation from states. You know, so for example, in the Netherlands, you know, you know, there's a jail and, you know, all of that, but if they want to get someone, you know, they have to depend on other states to sort of support them. So it is a court of last resorts. It's far from perfect, but this is not a time to say that, you know, well, it's not gonna, it's not useful or anything like this, you know. And some of us who were the only kind of collective group that is advocating for environmental justice at the ICC, we like to think from it another way, is that like this could make the ICC even more relevant than it is today, you know, because the climate is such a powerful, you know, as I said yesterday, psychic, you know, following kind of, you know, Guattari, like it's like a psychic, social, environmental kind of a, you know, up and down this scale, right? That perhaps people will take the ICC more seriously if they were to take, you know, ecocide seriously.
Thank you so much for your answer on that. Just a follow-up question to that as well. I fully agree with you, and I think that even if ICC is not perfect, it still has a purpose and it still has a function, and I think that's still to be developed. But in addition to the ICC, do you see any other, let's say, possible governing body where also these questions could belong to, or is ICC the only place?
No, not at all. I mean, national jurisdiction is an obvious example. It doesn't have to be an international body. But the thing about the ICC is that it's a criminal court, you know, so you cannot take a civil case there, you know, which might be useful, but not if you want criminal justice, or justice really, you know. So it is, but national jurisdictions, you know, can actually, like the idea is that if national jurisdictions cannot deal with it, then it could go to the ICC, or if it's a cross-border dispute or conflict and so on, international conflict, you know. Bangladesh, Myanmar, you know, case with the Rohingya refugees, it is, you know, quite radical that, like, you know, that even though the Burmese military government is not signatory to the Rome Statute, the ICC can open an investigation because of the cross-border nature of the conflict, where the Rohingyas entered Bangladeshi territory, who is a signatory state. They can say that actually this is part of what happens in crimes against humanity, with forced deportation into a territory that is signatory can trigger jurisdiction, you know. So what that means for the military generals in Rohingya, of course, the challenge is if no one shows up in court, you cannot really have a case, you know. But suppose there was a judgment, you know, it doesn't necessarily change, you know, facts of life for the refugees, you know, other than that they might be able to, you know, sometimes, you know, justice isn't about, you know, I mean, justice isn't here in money and things like this. It's to actually, you know, it's not even about punishing that person so much, but really about kind of like being recognized for what that crime was, right? You know, I suppose, you know, I'm being very abstract about it. It's very much, I mean, it's a very deep personal thing, you know. But, you know, what it could mean for a military commander is that, you know, all of a sudden they may not be able to travel anywhere. Let's say, you know, you go to another country for a holiday or something, you know, you could be captured. And these things, if you think about it, you know, a warlord or a military guy in Burma or wherever may not care, you know, but suppose, you know, the boss of a big oil company, you know, even if an attempt was made to say that, you know, this person is being examined as someone who committed ecocide or crimes against humanity, all of a sudden, you know, they definitely wouldn't want that to happen, you know, absolutely not, because their whole basis is to put up a front where they're nice people with suits and, you know, they're, you know, whatever, you know. So I think, you know, there's ways around. Also, the concept of universal jurisdiction is where, let's say, you could commit a crime in state A, but state B could come after you because what you've committed is so bad that it triggers, you know, the notion of universal jurisdiction. You know, so that's another possibility. which is actually quite effective to go after individuals. And by the way, this is about individual responsibility. Criminal justice isn't about saying, you know, the state or that corporation. It's about individuals' freedom, you know, like naming that person, you know, or those people that are responsible for a crime.
Do you have any more comments or questions, or? Okay, so maybe it's good time to close the discussion. So thank you so much for your commentaries, for your questions, and thank you, Nabil, for the wonderful lecture and everything.
Thanks everyone for coming. Yeah.